So we should probably mention first off that concerts with audiences, actual audiences, are going to start again, and decent sized audiences too, it looks like. Looking forward to getting back into the concert hall, Richard?
Well, I started getting these emails and messages to such an extent about what was going on that I kind of had to step back, take stock, create a big list of them all just to try and get my head and my diary in some sort of order. I counted, I think, something in the region of 40 opera productions are scheduled to open at the UK between now and the end of August.
Wow.
Yeah, if they all happen, and there's no reason to suppose at present they won't. I mean, we're kind of back where we were 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Obviously, socially distanced audiences, all sorts of things will be very, very different. But, I think, this looks, touch wood, hopeful at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it's great. And it was good to see some of those sort of pilot schemes going on. I mean, the most obvious one, I think, was the snooker World Championships. And lots of people in the arts sort of moaning about the fact that sport was allowed to do it, but no one else was. But it was a pilot scheme. It was done on purpose to benefit, in fact, everyone else in the end. And it seems to have worked, Charlotte. I bet you're keen to get back in there.
Yes, indeed. I mean, it's been fun, actually. I've been like a kid in a sweet shop the past couple of days, but it's been interesting looking at the Barbican. I think they're doing it really well, having the 3:30 concert and then the 7:30 or 8 o'clock concert, and the whole just putting the same program a few times. I think people are learning all of the lessons, and as you say, you look at the seats that are on offer. It's a decent size audience we're going for. I actually the tears welled up as I picked my first concert. I'm going to hear Simon Rattle and the London Symphony Orchestra do Britain's Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra next week. And I know when the brass kick in for their final call, I'm just going to be in a puddle on the floor.
Well, I mean, that happens anyway, because it's one of the great moments, isn't it?
But what a brilliant piece to open with, reintroducing the orchestra after all this time. For a second, I thought, really? Kind of a kid's piece? And I thought, no, this is absolutely perfect.
Well, I see they've announced some more concerts as well for the Aldeburgh Festival, such as it is, with ticketing opening on Saturday. And I will almost have missed that unique experience of sitting in an online ticket queue for 3 hours only to find there's nothing left when you get to the end of it. But at least they're doing it. It's fantastic, and really excited to start going back to concerts again. About time too. Anyway, let's get on. This is the Classical Top 5. I'm Tommy Pearson, and with me as ever are Richard Bratby and Charlotte Gardner, and our subject this week is trios. Not the musical form within a work, as suggested by someone on Twitter. Lots of lovely trios to choose from there, but that might be for another day. No, we mean trios as in 3 players. The classic lineup is the piano trio, of course, piano, violin, cello. But there are an infinite number of combinations of 3 instruments, and composers have been exploring those from the beginning. So a huge repertoire to pick from, as usual. And to help us through it, and to pick her own top 5 trios, is a pianist and writer, renowned as a soloist and chamber musician. Indeed, she won the 2013 Corbett Medal for Distinguished Service to Chamber Music, and has been in the Domus and Gaudier ensembles, as well as the celebrated Florestan Trio. She's written 5 fascinating books on music, including Beyond the Notes and Speaking the Piano. And her next, The Piano, A History in 100 Pieces, is out in July. It's such a pleasure to welcome Susan Tomes. Thank you so much for doing this, Susan. It's wonderful to see you and to have you on Classical Top 5. Now we must just mention first off that book, The Piano, A History in 100 Pieces. Now, we've asked you to come up with 5 pieces for trios, which will have been a challenge in itself. But how on earth, with such a rich, varied and huge repertoire that the piano has, do you choose only 100 pieces to tell its history?
I know, well, I mean, it is a bit of a game, I admit, just as even trying to choose 5 piano trios, it's a game really, because when I kind of started to scribble down my top 5, piano trios, and within a moment I had got to 25. This kind of start. And of course, it's the same with piano music. If you were, you could try to write the piano a history in 5,347 pieces. But this is just a way of, I guess it was actually picking up from ideas like A History of the World in 100 Objects by Neil MacGregor, which is just a very clever way of kind of tiptoeing across the terrain and giving people a glimpse of. In my case, I tried to pick 100 pieces which represented something significant, or even just something I loved, or something eccentric, just to give a kind of series of stepping stones.
Yes.
And I think, and I've realized that my 100 choices were probably not the 100 choices, that another pianist or another person would make, but in a way I saw it as an opportunity to do things like bring in some chamber music and bring in some jazz and some light piano music and things like that, which perhaps, not everybody would choose, but I do. And in particularly in relation to chamber music, I do genuinely think that that chamber music are some of the best works of the composers that that I've been talking about, I think, and some of the piano trios are the best of the piano repertoire written by those composers. So I saw it as a chance to do something for chamber music, which might not appear in say a concerto soloist's selection.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and we often talk on the podcast about the Bible and Shakespeare choices, the ones that are absolute in a way, that are inarguable, that we don't almost need to bother choosing because everybody agrees that they should be there somewhere. Have you got some of those?
Definitely, yes. And in fact, just looking at how people had answered your question on Twitter yesterday,
yes.
I think they were coming up, weren't they, almost immediately. Starting with Beethoven Archduke Trio, which I think just has to be there, doesn't it? It's such a sort of extraordinary achievement on his part. But shall we talk about that? Or
yeah, so that's definitely one of your choices.
It is definitely, yes. I think it has to be. I mean, I did consider choosing one of the Beethoven Opus 70s. Number one, The Ghost. Number two, in E flat, which are both of which are great favorites of mine. But I think, if one's going to choose one Beethoven trio, it has to be the Archduke, really, which is the last of his trios in B flat Opus 97.
How many times do you think you've played it? Quite a few, I would imagine.
Yes, quite a few. But I do remember, I think it was the first time I played it in public, which was in the Castle Hotel in Taunton, actually. They had a concert series. And that was the first time I encountered what it was like to perform it live in public and not to be able to stop and have a rest, and have a break. It was such an intense experience that I do remember sort of somewhere near the start of the final movement, I actually thought I was going to faint from exertion, actually, exertion of different kinds. And at that, just for a moment, I wasn't sure I could actually make it to the end. and I think that is a reflection of what an enormous stature this piece has and how many demands it makes on the players. It's just not only technically but emotionally and intellectually as well. And it seemed like one was trying on so many fronts at the same time, and also in the presence of an audience, which adds that extra sort of adrenaline and extra, the consciousness of what other people are hearing and so on. That adds a whole dimension to it. It just suddenly seemed to me to be a mountain to climb, and in a way, it's never lost that feeling for me. I think it's in performance, and it usually lasts about 45 minutes, depending on how many repeats you take. And so it's a very long, it's an extended play, much of which is technically difficult. So it's you do need to sort of build up stamina when you're learning how to perform it, and you have to learn how to pace yourself as well, so that there are bits where you can save your energy, for what's coming up. And like many pieces actually, or like some of the others I've chosen, some of the most demanding things come near the end or in the final movement. So you've already been playing at full stretch for half an hour before the terrifying passages of the finale, heave into view, and you realize that you have to find that extra. I guess it's a little bit like runners talk about, are having to find that final sprint. To make it to the finish, you have to sort of extra reserves of energy to call on to.
Well, you bring up something interesting. It also came up in our discussion about quintets, and that's the role of the piano within the ensemble, and how I think it was Andrew Havron, the violinist, was saying that some of the pieces that he thinks, so he doesn't really think of them as properly as an ensemble piece. He thinks of them as piano pieces with other instruments, and that certainly happens, doesn't it, within trios as well. The role of the piano perhaps slightly changes over the centuries.
I think so. I think it's a lot to do with the fact that many of the composers were pianists themselves and performing pianists. So they probably conceived these works as being, for themselves with friends and colleagues. I think that it gives a particular flavour to the pieces.
Okay, well, Archduke, there we go. I mean, as Susan mentioned, very popular choice also on Twitter from all of our people, our friends. Thank you very much, all of you, for offering up your top fives and your favourites. Archduke definitely near the top. You are both string players, aren't you, Charlotte, Richard? Archduke got to be in there, Richard?
Yes, I mean it's hard to overestimate its importance in this piano trio repertoire. It's sort of it's the great monument at the sort of gateway of the entire repertoire. I mean, he's only a generation away from the Haydn trios. I mean, Haydn, you just talked about the changing role of the different instruments. Basically, Haydn was writing in a period when you couldn't really rely upon domestic keyboard instruments to be particularly strong, particularly impressive. And essentially, the other instruments were there as reinforcements. He's writing violin sonatas with the cello boosting the bass line. Then Mozart gets a bit away from that. Haydn, I think, saw what potential was there in later life, but kind of didn't really move away from it, though he filled it with the most fantastic invention. I mean, his trios are some of those glorious trios there are, but there isn't much for the cello to do, which from my perspective is a little frustrating as a cellist. Then you've got, Beethoven, Opus 1, his very first published work, a set of 3 trios. And he's kind of, he's a chick. The piano trio is sort of the chick pecking out of the eggshells here of the classical form. And then finally with the Archduke, sort of the last of his series of, I think he wrote 6 trios in total, didn't he? 6 full-scale trios. There it is. Suddenly it's standing before us, a symphonic piano trio that's going to dominate the 19th century and still dominates the way we think about the form. It's never going to be the same again. This is a piece on a symphonic scale, 4 movements, grand in its sweep. I mean, playing it as a cellist, I get the same kind of rush of excitement, of the sense of being on an adventure I get from some of the bigger Beethoven string quartets, like the Opus 59 set. They have this sort of really broad sweep, this grandeur. And it's such a, I mean, I as an amateur musician, there's only been a few times in my life where I've had access to a pianist who has been sympathetic and good enough to play these pieces well, to play them satisfactorily without either drowning out the string players, running away, or just not being able to get around the notes. The times we did the Archduke, I mean, it felt like a feast, like a banquet. This grand sweeping opening. There's this brilliant moment just near the beginning, after the first big cadence, where the strings almost kind of have a mini cadenza, as if he's announcing that we're doing something on a big, on an opulent, on a flamboyant scale here. So much variety. The slow movement, which is in the world of the Pathetique Sonata, that profound inward Beethoven, that deeply emotional kind of Beethoven adagio, intense beauty. Playful scherzo, which right in the middle swings off into this sort of romantic Weber-style grand valse, glittering virtuosity. And then this playful finale, the Haydn-style finale, just lifted onto an absolutely epic scale. So it looks ahead to Schubert. I'm pretty sure Schubert did look very closely at the Archduke when he wrote his own two full-scale piano trios. But yeah, it's just, the piece it's an absolute banquet of a piece, and it stands there almost at the start of the romantic piano trio repertoire. Everything measures up against it, or in reaction to it, or in response to it.
Charlotte, sorry, Susan, yes, you want to come back?
I was just going to say, I thought that was a very good point about it being on a symphonic scale, because there's something sometimes you find yourself wondering, why on earth did he write such music for just 3 people to play? Should he not rather have written a symphony and put these ideas into a symphony? But I think there's something very touching about a work on this scale being delivered by just 3 people, one on each instrument, that they have to really represent so much. Each player and the 3 of them together have to paint this enormous canvas. So I think there's something almost sort of paradoxical about such a small group of musicians delivering music on such an epic scale, as Richard said. That's it has an effect sort of out of proportion to to the number of people involved. And if you are one of the 3 people, you do feel that you have to be more than 3. You have to give the effect of being like an orchestra delivered through 3 people.
Well, and that's slightly easier to do if one of the instruments is piano. But what's been a real pleasure for me, listening to lots of trios in prep for this podcast, is how composers use the instruments they've got, even if one of them isn't a piano, for these wonderful array of rich colors, and you forget that it is only 3 instruments. I mean, I guess that's the mark of a great composer. Charlotte, let's jump in with one of your choices straight away.
Okay, well, I've decided to go for Debussy Piano Trio in G major as my first one. Now, this was a young piece written by young Debussy in 1880 on what was effectively a really cushy summer job. He'd just finished at the Paris Conservatoire. And he got taken on by Tchaikovsky's patroness, a businesswoman, Nadezhda von Meck. And she wanted someone with her on her summer travels to teach her kids piano. And so lucky old Debussy, he went to Russia, France, Switzerland, Italy, and in Florence they hooked up with some Russian musicians, and Debussy wrote this trio for them to all play together. And he clearly liked this piece a lot. He sent it to his publisher Durand, describing it as lots of notes accompanied by lots of friendship. And yet I cannot understand why it wasn't published until 1986, which just seems extraordinary when it's just delicious. I mean, it's not adventurous, fully formed Debussy, but it's melodic, it's quirky, sensuous, dreamy, beautifully balanced. 4 movements. The first begins, it's sort of a whimsical, searching, sunny melody from the violin with piano accompaniment, and then the cello takes that up and the violin re-enters, and they sort of wrap themselves around each other. And it's full of these wonderful, delicious little lilting stops and starts. And then, my gosh, the second movement, scherzo, is just wonderful. This feather-light confection of pizzicato and capricious rhythms, the more serious middle section. It makes Ravel's pizzicato second movement sound like kind of the big kid in the playground that everybody's scared of. It's just so light and sweet. It reminds me of dreamy French ballet mixed with Mendelssohn, mixed with Saint-Saëns at his lightest. And then this dreamily lyrical andante with espressivo. It sounds like Russians and a Frenchman basking in Italian warmth in Florence. And then this wonderful perfumed, impassioned final. I just think it's not heard enough, and it's wonderful stuff. And sure, it's not up there with the Archduke, and some of my later choices might be. But for me, it's just one that everybody needs to listen to.
I don't think anyone will be surprised to know that everything that I've chosen is from the 20th century. I did try actually a bit of 21st century. I couldn't quite land on one that could make my top 5. But I mean, as I said before, there's some fascinating choices on Twitter, and as always, pieces I'd never heard of, and often composers I'd never really come across, which I really need to start listening to some of those and seeing what they're like. But the first one I was going to choose was Shostakovich's Piano Trio number 2. Number 1 was written when he was a student, and actually very interesting piece to hear, because as always with Shostakovich, there it is already almost fully formed, his musical language right there when he was a teenager. But 2 is much later. It's 1940s, 1944, written on the back really of the death of a great friend and mentor, Ivan Solutinsky, who was only 41, died of a heart attack, and that really affected Shostakovich greatly, and it's all there in the music. But it's yet another one of those extraordinary Shostakovich chamber pieces, or indeed any Shostakovich, which is just totally unmistakable, particularly in a sort of classic, if you might say, classic Shostakovich fast movement. It's all there. All the things you want from Shostakovich are there. And then I was thinking about that and thinking, well, actually, that's every Shostakovich piece, really, isn't it? Every piece we can talk about. All the Shostakovich bits are there. So it gives you that on that level. But what I love about it is what I always love about this kind of writing. I do have a real love for muscular, rhythmic string writing. I don't mind a bit of tune and sensuousness and all the rest of it. But actually, what really gets me going is good, tough, fast, often harsh playing, rhythmic string playing. And there's a lot of that in Shostakovich's second piano trio. And in fact, I just listened to a recording where we used to call it, Mike Seal, the conductor, who was a violinist, very fine violinist, we used to call it zuzzing, when you play on the string hard enough that it sort of makes the zzz sound as much as the note. There was plenty of that on this recording. It made it so exciting, and it was brilliantly recorded as well, right into the center of the music. I find that piece really fabulous. And I get as so much of Shostakovich's chamber music that I've been discovering, it's some of his finest works. Susan, have you played the second trio?
I was going to say, actually, that is one of my top 5, as it turns out. And not so much because it is my personal favorite, but because I have been very impressed by the way the audience responds to it. And actually, speaking as a pianist, it's not my favorite piano part to play for the reasons you gave. Actually, that there's a lot of percussive, repetitive, rhythmic stuff. I suppose a lot of it designed to build up the effect of kind of ruthless machine, which has captured people in it, in a kind of relentless march forward. That kind of thing, or you could say the feeling of hearts pounding with fear throughout the piece, or whatever. So for that reason, it's actually the piano part is quite sparely written and repetitive, as I say. So in rehearsal, I admit that I had been quite fed up with a lot of the way the piano part is written, and then in performance, you suddenly realize how much this piece can connect with the audience. I remember sort of getting to the end of a performance and looking around and seeing people with tears in their eyes, in the front rows of the audience, and then that gave me a sort of new respect for Shostakovich and what he had created there through actually quite simple and straightforward means, repetitive pounding being a lot of it, and a kind of how he often writes, it seems like sort of mocking dance music. Sort of seems very, very cynical, as though something which people are being forced to do, and that, I think, the audience correctly picks up on that as well. So now when I look at it, I still think that it's not the loveliest piano part to play, and I still think that it is sparely written and repetitive. But I now understand that there is a power that comes through that, which really it really conveys something to the audience.
But also it's more part of the color of the whole group, isn't it? The piano, therefore.
Yes.
It's so much, it's there as percussive, but it's also part of the color rather than a lead instrument, like we were talking about with the earlier pieces, isn't it?
Yes, it's motoric. Yes.
Right.
yes.
Well, I'm very pleased we could both pick that. Richard, one from you.
Well, I was not really sure about definition of trios. It seems a shame to waste the subject of piano trios, and we've got Susan here. On the other hand, I've played a lot of string trios as well, just conventional string trios, violin, viola, and cello. And then there are pieces which don't really fit any of the conventional descriptions. And one of the pieces I really love is one I've never played, and probably will never play, because I don't play any of the instruments in it. It's Mozart's so-called Kegelstadt Skittle Alley trio. I mean, it's the story goes that he wrote it while playing around at Skittles. That seems extremely dubious. If he wrote anything while playing Skittles, I think someone said it's probably a pair of a series of woodwind duets which have now been lost. But everyone loves this story of Mozart just taking dictation from heaven and writing stuff off the cuff. The point is, this particular piece is fascinating because it does seem that he wrote it for the 16-year-old daughter of a family friend who played the piano extremely well, though not as a professional. Probably his friend Anton Stadler, the clarinetist, fellow Freemason, quite a character known as Red Currant Face, apparently, because of the way he used to look when he was blowing. And then probably we can assume Mozart himself on viola. That was the string instrument he loved to play. I was researching his violin concertos recently, just astonished to discover that he didn't even own a violin when he died. He was so sick of playing it in Salzburg, where it was considered quite a low status instrument, and also presumably it was his father's instrument, and he was quite keen to get away from that. But he never really played it after he left Salzburg in 1780, and his preferred instrument was a viola. But anyway, we have this lovely trio, which is clearly written for three personalities, three friends. This 16-year-old girl who's clearly an extremely expressive and very gifted pianist, though also clearly not a virtuoso. The part is not flamboyant, it's not flashy, and I kind of like that about it. It's you're around at a friend's house, you're playing with a 16-year-old daughter in front of friends, in front of family. What you don't need to show off. You don't need to do the big virtuoso thing. I mean, vulgar to do that. It's just about making music. And throughout this whole piece, there isn't really a fast movement. It's sort of it's a flowing first movement, a minuet and trio in the middle with a lovely C minor central section, and that lovely dark colours brought out by the viola and the clarinet. And then again, a finale that just kind of ambles. And this is Mozart showing his sort of his kind of private self, his friendly self, his social self, the self his friends knew, his intimate circle, or people who weren't necessarily the great musicians or the great noblemen. It really gives you this feeling of being at home, listening to these three people playing together, the music of friends, people call chamber music. And of course, also, I mean, within that mixture, you've got two of the loveliest colours that Mozart deployed in his palette, the viola, which is such an important piece of presence in pieces like the Sinfonia Concertante and his string quintets, that dusky, deep tone. And then, of course, the clarinet, for which, I mean, everything he wrote for clarinet is pretty much a masterpiece. He loved the sound of that instrument and that player. And then, again, this, we must assume, charming, gifted, clearly highly musical, clearly highly sensitive daughter of his friend playing the piano, and all coming together as equals, all making music as friends. And this piece, the Kegelstadt Trio, it's only about 20 minutes in duration. It's three movements. It's not meant to be a big public statement, but I think it's one of the most touching, beautiful, personal things Mozart ever wrote. And I don't mind that we don't hear it in concert halls too much, because it really is a piece for friends and for home.
Well, this is a very key part, I think, of chamber music's attraction, isn't it? That it often is for friends. There is that intimacy, but also, I mean, I was struck, Susan, you were saying about the first time you played the Archduke. It wasn't in a major concert hall, and of course, as chamber musicians, you do often play in major concert halls, but actually, most of the time, you're playing in smaller venues around countries and doing tours with smaller audiences, and it seems very appropriate for the kind of music that you're playing.
Yes, yeah, that's true. And also, of course, a lot of the music we're talking about was written at a time when people did make music domestically, and it was considered a nice social accomplishment to be able to play something and to be able to join in with music making after dinner. And I think for women pianists at the time, they wouldn't have been encouraged to perform in public. Indeed, they wouldn't have been allowed to perform in public by their families, certainly very, very probably, but they would have been encouraged to perform at home. Yeah. And so I think a lot of music making which went on, chamber music making which went on at home as a normal course of family evenings or evenings with friends. And very sadly, that has diminished, hasn't it, through the 20th century. And now I think people are so used to just turning to their iPhones and playlists and so on for their music that is their first sort of recourse if they want to hear some music. It's not to ring their friends and say, bring your cello around and let's have a go at this trio. So which I suppose is one reason why piano trios and so on are not so routinely written by composers these days. So I do feel it's starting to be a form that is more associated with 19th century, 18th, 19th century, early 20th century, when there was still a thriving culture of making music at home with family and friends.
One of my girlfriends when I was a teenager, she was one of three girls. Oldest was viola, the middle one was violinist, and she was a cellist. And no one's ever going to tell me that wasn't designed for a nice evening soiree music making with the family. It's beautifully judged, I thought, across a few years there of how to channel your children into something.
And that reminds me actually of that marvelous piece by Mozart for string trio, the divertimento, is it K563 in E flat, which is really one of his most marvelous chamber works. And one rarely hears that in concert either, and partly because it's technically very demanding, isn't it, Richard? But a great trio.
Funnily, actually, one of my choices is Mozart K564 for all the reasons that everybody else has just said. This is his string trio in G major, and I began, it's a very, very personal one for me. I started my secondary school life at a school which got about as close to being a music school as a normal school could get. We even had practice periods built into the school timetable, but it closed. So from being in this fabulous school orchestra where we were doing everything from Bach suites to Leroy Anderson and Walter Murphy's The Fifth of Beethoven, I ended up in this very normal school with a very normal cohort of musicians. And age 13, I was the best violinist in the school orchestra, which was not great, but there was a good cellist in the school and a good pianist in the school, and suddenly the head of music had his piano trio. So all of the decent music making I had in between the ages of 13 to 18 were in this piano trio at school. And the one that sticks in my head the most was this K564. It was the last piano trio that Mozart wrote, and there's an extent to which, if you're a Mozart scholar, perhaps you look at this one and go, what? The last one he wrote, and you'd expect it to be sort of the crowning achievement of his piano trio repertoire, but it's not. It's this thing that's really, it's for amateurs. It's simple, it's light, it's short, it's not profound or obviously clever. It's well within the technical reach of most people. And it was first published in England rather than Vienna, and to a public that's still saw the keyboard as the main instrument, and it was advertised as being for keyboard with piano and cello accompaniment, although actually it's really, really well balanced. I have a feeling that the publisher just put that one in to hook the fuddy-duddies in, and then they would get this piece that was actually for all three of them. And it's just a piece of perfection. It has such purity in its emotional world, and also just there not being one single extraneous or misplaced note. And it's a piece of a merry dialogue between friends, and sometimes that's as good as profundity. And it was the final I especially loved. There's this innocent, elegantly sunny dance in a soft dotted Siciliano rhythm, becomes peasanty later on, and minor keyed section for some added colour. And towards the end, there's these sweet little grace notes, and it's just full of lovely interplay between the two parts, and gorgeous, gorgeous stuff to play. It makes me want to play it now with some wine and some friends. But it was the piece that, I hummed it through my entire teenage life. And even though I'm not sure, and Richard was saying earlier, I'm not sure that I would necessarily want to hear this one in concert so much. It seems made for an intimate setting. And when I hear it, I see the expressions on my friends' faces. I hear the squeak of the lino underneath our feet and the echo of the schoolroom that we were in. It's very, very happy memories.
You see, as a percussionist, yet more great repertoire denied, sadly. But on the other hand, as a broadcaster, I was able to sort of slightly get involved in various things with chamber music. And my next choice is one of those. In the mid-90s, I was asked to do a series of pre-concert talks all the way around Britain. It's a tour of a new piece. And it was Judith Bingham's trio, piano trio, Chapman's Pool. This was in 1997, and I knew Judith a bit. Judith, fine composer, was a professional singer, part of BBC Singers for many years. And it occurred to me actually when I was thinking about her that right now, when there's such a eagerness and hunger to find all of these female composers that no one's ever heard of before, one forgets that there is actually a good solid group of female composers who've been working for many decades that are really great composers and could also do with more performances. Thank you very much. And I think Judith is one of those. This is one of her most successful pieces, though. I guess it helps that it's a trio, so it's a little bit more easier to stage. But Chapman's Pool is a place on the Isle of Purbeck, and this is a place I know very, very well. I love the Isle of Purbeck. I love Corfe Castle and Old Harry Rocks, and we have some personal connections with that area as well. So it's a piece that speaks to me too. And this was Judith going there and sort of exploring around. It's the part of the Jurassic coast as well. So a lot of this comes feeding into the piece. Sailing at night, so which is a very particular thing, of course, because it's, you know, total darkness underneath you. You never quite know where you are, and you don't really know where the land is either. It's a very particular kind of thing to do, and she puts that in the music as well. She's a brilliant writer. I think it's very just wonderful, clear, nicely orchestrated ideas always in her works, and with just these three instruments, I think she does it in a very powerful way. But it's a piece that's comes out of that experience at Purbeck, but also then is coloured by, at that point, the very recent death of her mother, as she was sort of, I think, starting the second movement. So that goes into the piece too. And I think you can really, really feel that. It's a very intimate piece. It's a piece you want to be close up to. And I'm very pleased, actually, that the first experiences I had of this piece were very close up, right there on the stage with the performers. It was written for the Gould Trio, and they were the ones that performed it, certainly on tour for the first year. And Judith and I went around all of these performances and gave pre-concert talks beforehand. And I'm very fond of that memory, because when we went to Cheltenham, we landed in Cheltenham at the Pitville Punt Room, and we had the classic Cheltenham experience in the pre-concert talk, because there they all were of a certain age, shall we say. And we were wearing little microphones on our shirts, and Judith had this microphone particularly placed. So every time I made her giggle, she would shake, and her microphone and her bra would go just like that. Very embarrassing. We had to cut the microphones off. So we take the microphones off, and, you know, this is an important piece to her, and it's got a lot of emotional baggage attached to it. So a lot of what we were talking about is quite serious, but for some reason, I was able to make Judith laugh a lot and giggle a lot. So she did a lot of giggling. So we had to stop that. So we then did it, because it was a relatively small audience and it's a small hall. So we did it without microphones. And there we were halfway through, and she was talking about, you know, the death of her mother and all the rest of it. And halfway through speaking, this woman in the front row said, "Excuse me." And what? "Excuse me, would you mind looking at me while you're talking? I can't hear you." And that to me was the quintessential Cheltenham experience. Well, that was one great evening that was. But anyway, getting back to the music, it is a fabulous piece. There are a couple of really good recordings. I'm going to put one up on our Spotify playlist so you can hear that too. I just think Judith Bingham's music needs to be heard far more, and this is a sensational little piece from 1997 called Chapman's Pool. And Susan, let's go back to you for another one.
Okay, so number 3, I'm jumping back in time, because we have to talk about Schubert. And Schubert wrote 2 great piano trios. I think for a long time, the B-flat trio was my favorite. And then I got to know the E-flat trio, which is just a tiny bit later, dates from, I think, the last year of his life, and is one of his most monumental works. Again, it takes about 50 minutes to perform 4 enormous movements. It's a little bit like the Archduke in those characteristics. You know, it's written on an epic scale, extremely technically difficult in parts for all 3 instruments, and requiring, you know, a great deal of finesse, stamina, emotional range, and all that. It's just the most an extraordinary intellectual achievement, I think, of Schubert's. And I think Schumann, when talking about those 2 trios, he characterized the B-flat Schubert trio as being feminine and the E-flat trio as being masculine. So, and I think, you know, these days we're not allowed to characterize things like that. But one knows what he means, and something rather stern about the E-flat trio, something quite uncompromising, which you notice right from the start, because he doesn't at all try to create a sort of a touchy-feely first theme. You know, he's straight in there with his kind of rhythmic motifs and his sort of stern development of these tiny cells, you know, into longer units. So quite Beethoven-like in that respect as well. And again, you know, when one is sort of building up to playing it, you have to sort of work up a bit like an athlete, you know, working towards being able to perform something like that. And again, with the last movement and some of the most technically difficult stuff, including terrifying passages for the cello, which aren't they? This and super fast. So you have to learn again, like with the Archduke, to pace yourself through that, so that you still have the requisite amount of energy, to get to the end. And the way that he weaves in the theme of the slow movement, which is based on a Swedish folk song, I believe, "The Sun Sinks," it would be called in English. And that very sad theme he brings back in a sort of genius way, and towards the end of the last movement, where you suddenly hear it kind of weaving through very fast virtuoso passages being played around it, and gradually you realize that this is a very complex kind of portrait which is being built up at the end there. It's quite incredible. So Schubert E flat, that has to be one of my top 5.
You mentioned about the energy and sustaining the energy and everything, but what about the voicing and the balance within this particular ensemble? I mean, you play piano in lots of different types of setups and ensembles, but what about this one in particular with violin and cello? What are the challenges of the balancing there? And also, how do you decide where you're going to sit in the trio itself? Because that must be incredibly important as well.
Do you mean physically? Do you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in our case, we generally did it so that the keyboard of the piano was sort of in the middle of a triangle. So I'm sitting at the piano, and the violinist would be behind me slightly to my right, and the cellist would be slightly in front of me to the left. So we're forming a triangle on the stage. And I find it very important to have sight lines as well as sound lines, because I actually hate it if one of the others in the group is sitting with their back to me, as sometimes happens with duos where, well, for example, I have played with cellists who like to put their chair facing right out front to the audience and far away from the piano, so that you just see the back of their head, and they can't even turn to look at you because the angle would be too sharp. And so they don't turn to look at you. I hate that. I feel there's there have to be lines of communication for me, so that one can indicate in different ways, what you're trying to do, and they can indicate, and you have a chance of picking it up, because you can see as well as hear. You can see the body language, and it's important to be able to see both hands of the other people who are playing. I think not just the bowing hand, but also the left hand. That's sometimes a problem with me for the way the cellist sits, that I just where they sit, I can see their right hand, and I can't always see the left hand on the fingerboard of the cello. But that's important too, because sometimes you just need to be able to time. You see exactly where their hand is moving on the fingerboard, so that you can coincide with where they land, for the next note. So I think not all pianists would agree with me about the sight lines being so important, but they are for me.
Yeah.
So I like to sit in the middle.
Richard, anything unusual on your list there?
Well, are we allowed to talk about string trios? I mentioned them earlier, as well as piano trios. Trios seems such a broad rubric.
I said it at the beginning. Yeah, any trio will do. It doesn't really matter.
Well, let's talk about string trios then. We've touched on Mozart's great divertimento in E flat, which that is the Bible and Shakespeare work in that repertoire. It's not as big a repertoire as a piano trio repertoire. Violin, viola, and cello is a very, very difficult ensemble to balance. It seems so natural, the most simple thing in the world. You've got a top line, a middle line, and a bottom line. But all the great composers, eventually discovered the answer is to have 2 toppish lines, have a string quartet. That fills things out. Also makes things a lot less exposed. If you're sort of creating a texture with just the 3 instruments, everything counts all the time. There's nowhere to hide. There's no redundancy anywhere in that ensemble. Everything has to be clear. Everything has to be effective. All the players have to be on their mettle the entire time. And Mozart's E flat trio just finds that balance absolute perfection. E flat trio, he called it the divertimento. It's in 6 movements. It's a piece lasting nearly an hour in performance, throughout all of which the players have to be playing with absolute refinement, absolute concentration, absolute precision. For that reason, and I certainly we never ever took that out in public. The string trios we did take out in public. This is when I was playing sort of semi-professional in Sri Lanka, believe it or not. When we were asking a performance, we need to take one of our string trios out. And there are 2 works which absolutely works every time. Just zingers, perfectly written for ensemble. Sonorous, lay under the hand of the string players, made all their effects, and were just perfectly proportioned. One of them was Beethoven's Trio Opus 9, number 1. I mean, the tendency with Beethoven's scholarship and sort of fandom, if you like, is to assume that the Opus 9 string trios are like a kind of dry run of the Opus 18 string quartets. I would argue that in some ways they're even more perfect. They're actually more brilliantly achieved works than those quartets, technically and structurally, formally, the way he uses the medium. But the first of these 3 trios, they're all winners. But the first one in G major, everything works. Everyone begins with a lovely crunchy spread G major chord, ringing fanfare. You come off that into a really nicely put together adagio. Then you're off into a little symphonic movement, basically, in which everyone's parts, they lie under the hand, everything falls together. It's got all the things you'd want from a Beethoven allegro. You've got the striding basses, the big crescendos, the moments of sudden dramatic shock, big romantic slow movements, rather like that of the Opus 18 number 1 quartet, a sort of throbbing adagio in sort of 12/8 time, firecracker, hilarious sort of ups and down scherzo, and then this wild moto perpetuo of a finale for these 3 string instruments, which actually does this brilliant thing, which I think every player loves, of sounding much more difficult than it actually is. Probably shouldn't be giving this away. It's not technically as hard to play as it sounds to the audience. It makes a brilliant effect, very simple and very effective. The piece is an absolute delight.
Very good. Charlotte, a couple of the choices I noticed on Twitter were Baroque ones. Like I say, and Telemann Concerto for 3 for horn, recorder and bassoon. Please tell me you have a Baroque choice in your 5.
Do you know what? I haven't. And there is I know. There is a reason for this, though. The trio sonata is a bit of red herring because it's actually for 4 instrumentalists, not 3, because continuo is cello and harpsichord. So I couldn't find one that was genuinely 3 instruments that I wanted to shout about. But I did find a more unusual one, which was actually one of my very first ones in my list. Written in 1954, String Trio by Sandor Varese, which was a piece I didn't even know until last year, or perhaps 2019, when Nicholas Olstadt, the cellist, got together a group of chums and recorded it with the Bartók Piano Quintet for Alpha, and it won a 2020 Gramophone Chamber Award. And I was absolutely blown away by this piece. Varese was a Hungarian-Swiss composer, born in Hungary. Then the latter half of his life, he moved to Switzerland and became a citizen about a year before his death. And his language, it's melodic Hungarian folk-inspired serialism. He was a piano pupil of Bartók and a composition pupil of Kodai. He collected folk music in the field. He assisted Bartók with folk song gathering. He studied and taught at the Liszt Academy. And these 2 movements, it's a slow and then a fast one. I think the slow one is about 10 minutes and the fast one about 8 minutes. And the level of invention is absolutely extraordinary. He has the instruments rapping out these smart rhythmic figures with their knuckles on their instruments. There's bowing, there's strumming, there's pizzicato. Texturally, it's really, really adventurous. You have these sliding chordal textures sprinkled with pizzicato. And it's incredibly rich. I find myself forgetting as I listen to it that it's actually just a string trio. And incredibly intense as well. Actually, one of the things that I was noticing as I was going through all of my potential choices this past week is that there is something about the string trio which just is very, very intense. There's very rarely a down moment when you can all just take an emotional breather and relax for a little while. It just keeps coming at you. And this piece particularly, the end of the fast movement, there's in the last minute or so, there's double stopped glissandi sort of scrubbing with a bow, then pizzicato, then rapping with their knuckles and their instruments, and then this hard pizzicato chord to end. And it's like an onslaught to your ears. It's a shock almost, but it's absolutely brilliant at the same time. Incredibly intense, very dramatic. And this whole thing is just beguiling, the whole work. It really gets under your skin. It starts with this sort of almost funereal plodding. You'd have to listen to it, but it's very, very powerful. And the funny, I'm ashamed to say I hadn't even heard of Perez even before I heard this trio, but I became a convert.
Very good. Thank you very much, Susan. Let's move on to another one from you.
Okay, Schumann. Now, Schumann is quite a special case, and I've often noticed that his music really gets under the skin of performers who are living with it, rehearsing it, performing it, and so on. There's something about the way that, we know now that Schumann had mental health issues, and that he had sort of visions, fantasies, and so on that he couldn't always control, and they come out in his music. And he had a sort of private language in his music, which I think he tried to express these visions and fantasies in music. And sometimes he succeeds, and sometimes he seems to be struggling to do it and not quite succeeded, but persisting with trying to deliver it. And I find that the groups that I've worked with, they have absolutely loved and become quite obsessed with Schumann's music when working at it. And then in performance, I think there's often been, for me, a sort of a disappointment when I realize that the audience doesn't necessarily sort of get it. At least the reaction has often been one of puzzlement, I think, when we've performed Schumann trios, and that has come as a sort of unpleasant surprise, because by the time we get to performing them, we absolutely love them. Sort of, yes, really quite obsessed, I would say, with them. And I think we've all found the music going round and round in our head in the night, is that kind of thing. There's something very, very, very intriguing and private about it, which makes you feel that when you start to understand it, you're looking in on a very special world, and it makes you feel quite protective of Schumann. You sort of wish to. There's a vulnerability there which makes you want to sort of look after it, and you want other people to get it as well. And quite often audiences have said to me afterwards, what was all that about? I didn't really get that. It seemed to be, torrents of notes, and I couldn't quite see, what was at the core of it. So that's a frustration for me. But anyway, I've chosen the Piano Trio number 1 in D minor, which for me is the best balanced of his 3 formal piano trios. And right from the start, you do have this feeling that you're looking in on a dream world, very colorful, very, very intense, and full of of sudden contrasts, which is typical of Schumann. I think he saw the extrovert side and the introvert side of his nature as being, the two sides which were in either constant conflict or in constant partnership. And so for the performer, it's that challenge to flip from the one to the other type of character, and make them seem somehow plausible, not like a sudden interruption in the musical thought, but actually a continuation of it on another level, let's say. And in the D minor piano trio, in particular, there's a really magical slow movement, which very sorrowful, in which first of all, the violin sort of in fits and starts has a very sad and thoughtful melody, and then in the middle, this sort of consolation comes in the form of the cello answering with a long and effortless melodic line, which seems to knit together, all the sort of troublesome stops and starts of the opening. It's for me, it's a most marvelous piece of work in which you feel he's actually sort of daring to share with us something intensely personal.
Fascinating to hear that the trio by Shostakovich can connect so quickly and viscerally with an audience, but something like Schumann, audiences can still be grappling with it. Amazing, really, when you think about it.
Yes, and I think it's perhaps partly because Schumann, he's perhaps not the cleverest in the way that he distributes the voices through the musical texture. And for example, you often get the cello playing in exactly the same pitch range as the left hand of the piano, and can be the same with the violin as well. And then the texture is often very dense. There's a lot of stuff going on in the piano writing, which I think for him is like the equivalent of an artist doing cross-hatching in a drawing or something like that to create a feeling of shading and texture. But I think for audiences who haven't had the opportunity to grow into it and to listen to it many times, it just comes across as a sort of barrage. a barrage of texture and notes and density, which they can't quite pick out where are the voices which should be leading them through this forest of notes.
I just want to pick out a few other choices that were mentioned on Twitter by our listeners. Poulenc is oboe, bassoon, and piano trio. Mozart, Kegelstadt, there it is. Debussy piano trio. Arnold Bax, elegiac trio is in there. The Mozart Div K563 is there. Brahms horn trio, that's another one that's mentioned a lot, actually, as a masterpiece. Sublime, Sarah G says. What else have we got here? Mendelssohn, Opus 66. I love it when people only put opus numbers, as if we should just absolutely know exactly which piece we're
It's a one in C minor, Tommy.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That's excellent. Yeah, so we've got Poulenc again, horn, trumpet, and trombone trio. And what else? Schubert trios, Notturno, Smetana piano trio is in there. Ravel piano trio. Now that's another very popular choice. Is the Ravel. I'm constantly reminded of Stephen Maddock, the chief executive of CBSO, who points out that actually unusual with almost any other composer that pretty much every note that Ravel wrote is out there and being performed. There's very little that's ignored of Ravel's output because everything is so superb and people love playing it. And I guess the trio is very much part of that. Brilliant piece. What else have we got here? Marais. Wow. Brahms piano trio again. Beethoven Opus 8. Tabakova, Insight. Archduke, lots of mentions of Archduke, as I said. Morton Feldman. Hubert Parry, so many names here. I think you said, Susan, on Twitter, everybody's very imaginative in their choices. We always get that. We don't always just get the classic Byron and Shakespeare ones. We do get a lot of people put a lot of effort into finding the more unusual corners of the repertoire, and it's fantastic. One I wanted to throw in before we start throwing in our final choices briefly is the Penderecki string trio, which I love. It's such I've been talking about the sort of muscular nature of string writing that's in parts of the Shostakovich second trio. The Penderecki one is full of that. And in fact, I mean, this is not the Penderecki of the Threnody, the extremely difficult modern approach that he had in the 70s and 60s and 70s that perhaps is what he's best known for. He kind of softened a little bit. I think he changed tack quite dramatically one point, and I kind of went off his pieces when he did that, but actually I think the string trio is a tremendous return to form. This is from 1990, so it's not massively recent, but also not really in his famous period, if you like. Again, muscular, and he actually called it he's written in the language of late Bartók, and you can absolutely see what he means by that. Tremendous piece. Penderecki string trio, search that out if you can. Sansons, by the way, is another one. Sansons piano trio number 2. It's another very popular one. I think people mentioned. Just there's such warmth and generosity in that writing, isn't there? In the tunes, in the way it's brought to you. Just one of those glorious pieces that you just want. It's just one of those lovely warm bath pieces, isn't it? Just you can just relax into it. Wonderful, beautiful writing. And I wanted to also throw in the French ones. I mean, someone mentioned Poulenc, but Georges Auric's wind trio, for example, and there's also Jean Francais. There's quite a few really sunny works written for wind trios in particular. Wonderful. These were great standbys, fill-in material pieces for us when I was at Radio 3. You'd have these CDs with about 40 tracks on them, all with very, very different lengths. And you just pick one that fitted the gap that you happen to have in that hour, and you knew you were going to hit a winner because every single track is just lovely and wonderful to listen to and jolly and fun, and totally I don't know, it's unchallenging, wonderful. So much French wind trio music there to search out too. So those are ones. And Rachmaninoff, by the way, trio Elegiac is another one that no one mentions Rachmaninoff in anywhere. I don't think I could see anyone mentioning Rachmaninoff on Twitter or Facebook at all. But there he is. He's written a trio as well. So
2 trios.
So there's lots for me to throw in there. Richard, briefly throw in a couple of others. Just briefly let us know what we've missed out so far.
Well, in the piano trio world, I've got to throw in Ariensky's massive, great, sweeping, romantic barnstormer of a piano trio from around the turn of the century. It's kind of the piano trio you wish Tchaikovsky had written. Tchaikovsky did write a huge piano trio, grand, funereal, dark, turbulent piece, nearly 50 minutes long. Ariensky's has a lot more the Russian romanticism we imagine, 4 movements, glittering waltzes, sweeping climaxes, passionate melodies. Corker of a piece, doesn't get played much. String trios, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, again, another Russian, Tanayev's string trio in D major. This is a piece we used to play. Again, imagine if Tchaikovsky or Borodin had written a string trio. This is what he wanted to sound like. It's an absolute joy of a thing. Folksy melodies, deep, passionate Russian melancholy with slow movement, and a scherzo, which, because he's a master contrapuntist, Tanayev, a great scholar of counterpoint, he does the entire scherzo in reverse. Each section is played, and then everything is inverted, played upside down, and it all fits together. It all works. It's a very, very clever piece. Another string trio I absolutely have to mention. Another one, invaluable part of our repertoire. We used to play these things regularly because it always comes off, always works. It's an absolute delight. Is Dochnányi's Serenade, Opus 10, Hungarian, but not overwhelmingly Hungarian. There's not. You don't only taste paprika. Crisp, witty opening march, always neoclassical in its style. A lovely romanza, which is very evocative of some Bartok's night music, a sort of serene melody floating through this sort of pastoral landscape. And then the wittiest of finales. No one does I've said before, Dochnányi, no one does a Haydn style finale. Since Haydn, better than Dochnányi, and it's an absolute delight. It's pure entertainment. Very last thing I've got to mention. My favourite piece by Debussy, full stop, his sonata for flute, viola, and harp.
Yes. Another one that was mentioned a lot on social media.
A very late work. It's one of his set of piano of sonatas for various instruments he wrote in his very final days of his life. He only completed 3 during the war. He's dying of cancer. Whether he knew that or not at the time is not clear, but I think he knew something wasn't right. And this is an astonishing piece. It's clarity, it's fantasy, it's colour, and the way he creates a sense of darkness, a sense of mystery, and a sense of intense melancholy, yet at the same time within a sense of lightness, clarity, daylight. It's as if you're sort of in broad sunlight, you're looking at somber things, and somehow you're still seeing the light glinting off them, even while you acknowledge the shadows. It's a beautiful piece, and that combination harp, viola, and flute, again, it sort of takes that Mozart idea of the harp, clarinet, viola, clarinet, and piano, and sort of inverts it. Really finds the opposite sort of French way of looking at things. He was going to write a sonata, I believe, for oboe, horn, and harpsichord, and boy, I wish if there's one piece in existence that was never written, I wish I could hear. I would love to have heard that. Imagine what that sounded like.
Goodness gracious. No, you're right. It's an absolutely beautiful, beautiful piece. Charlotte, before we hear Susan's final choice of her 5, throw in a few that we've haven't mentioned so far from you.
Right. I'm going to start with the top of the pops choice, Mendelssohn Piano Trio number 1 in D minor, described by Schumann as the master trio of our age, in the same way that Schubert and Beethoven were for their times. Instant hit when he published it in 1839. How could it not have been? This is perfection for me. Got this impassioned first movement you can really get your teeth into as a player. Then just one of the most sublime slow movements surely that was ever written. Gorgeous to play, heartbreaking to not be able to play well enough. Perfect encore piece to send people home on. I always think it's such a just beautiful gift when they send us away with that one. And then this fantastic final as well. And funnily, Susan talking earlier about how Schumann, his piano textures are so thick. Part of the reason why Mendelssohn's trio ended up being as successful as it was because a friend of his, composer Ferdinand Hiller, said to him, you need to look at those broken chords in your piano accompaniment. It's kind of a bit simple and old-fashioned. So Mendelssohn toddled off and reworked it into this brilliant piano writing. That's what we have today. It's just absolutely magnificent. And then very out of character for me, I've chosen some Tchaikovsky, the piano trio in A minor, which Richard has already mentioned its funereal tone. It was subtitled To the Memory of a Great Artist. It was written for his great close friend, the pianist and conductor Arthur Rubinstein, who had died from TB aged 45. And the strange thing about this one is that it was only 2 or 3 years before that Tchaikovsky had vowed never to write anything for piano and strings. He absolutely hated the sound. He described it as genuine torture to listen to a trio or sonata because he felt that the piano and the strings were in battle with each other. But he was pleased with what he wrote for this one, and maybe that tussle in his head was why it was so good. And we were talking in the past earlier about pieces of chamber music that are almost orchestral and symphonic in their scale. And Tchaikovsky was a bit worried that he'd essentially written an orchestral piece with this one. But what really strikes me about it is that despite the symphonic length, the acid test is that there are some pieces of chamber music where instantly you're rescoring them in your head for orchestra. I don't do that with this Tchaikovsky. Everything, it's perfectly scored. This one, all I'm hearing is the instruments playing it, and they're demanding that you give them your full attention. And that for me is, in addition to its originality and the sheer passion and the dramatic weight of it, that's why it's so special. And then just a couple of others. Darius Milhaud's string trio from 1947. Gorgeous little piece, sort of quicksilver, lucid textures, sunny, intense, very intense again. And then also the Schnittke string trio, which, gosh, it's a miserable piece. Death is all over it. Yes, but an incredible piece, this wonderful melting. It was written in honor of the centenary of Alban Berg's death. And he recognizes both the first and the second Viennese schools in there, while flinging in some Jewish music and Shostakovich as he goes about it. And it's very, very powerful stuff, and all sorts of really interesting textures and musical effects going on.
All right, then. Thank you, Charlotte. Susan, your final choice then to finish us off.
And just before I get to that, I don't think any of us has mentioned Fauré, have they? The piano trio by Gabriel Fauré, which is a very late work. Under the influence, I think, of his study of medieval church music. Is very, very long, beautiful lines that seem to go on forever and gradually ratcheting up the tension in these long lines in a most brilliant way. So I have to mention him. But my final choice has already been mentioned by Tommy, and it's the Ravel piano trio, which really has to be one of my personal top 5. It's an exceptionally brilliant piece of imagining, I think, by him. Not a piece for amateurs unless they're awfully good, I think, because it is written with quite sort of merciless approach to technical mastery of the instrument for all three players. Very, very intricate to rehearse. It takes ages to work it up. But was it Einstein who said that everything should be as simple as possible, but not simpler? And I think that sort of somehow sums up for me the Ravel trio, because it is exceedingly complicated because it has to be. Somehow his imagination has come up with something so exceptionally brilliant and refined that it had to be expressed in that very complicated, intricate way. And when it's well performed, it's a dazzling thing to listen to. So I once sort of studied it in great detail, sort of analytically, and I was very, very impressed by the trouble that he had taken to put the movements together, using all kinds of probably mathematical principles and theories of proportion and things like that, and the way that the tempos change from bar to bar sometimes in a very subtle and very controlled way. So I was very impressed analytically, but leaving all that aside, I think the musical effect transcends the analytical effect, and for me, it just makes it one of the most complete of piano trios.
Susan, I've always believed that the greatest pieces have yet to be written. Are composers still writing for piano trio? Are you still getting new works?
Well, I mean, I would say the new works that I knew about were often commissioned by people like my groups and so on. And I do remember Alexander Gurr, who wrote a piano trio, and him saying, he probably said it to tease us, but he said he was very surprised when he was asked to write a piano trio because he thought that the piano trio was dead. And I think he wrote his in the 1960s, and even then he thought it was dead.
Well, it's probably more dead in the 60s than it is now, wasn't it?
Maybe so. Yes, maybe so. So I'm not sure how many composers are of their own initiative writing piano trios without having been asked to write them. I'm not certain about that, but certainly just mentioning trios that I had a hand in commissioning. Judith Weir, another Judith, has written a couple of excellent piano trios with her characteristic dry, witty, and kind of using the piano more like a percussion instrument than a melodic instrument, and beautifully written, well worth seeking out.
Oh, it's been fabulous to have you on, Susan. Thank you so much for doing this. And my goodness, we've been through an awful lot of repertoire again, as always. So much to listen to, so much to explore with composers that, some of which we've not come across before, and some absolute classics as well in there. Thanks so much. Susan, you should remind us again of your book that's coming out in July. Just remind us what it's called and where we might be able to get it.
Yeah, it's called The Piano, A History in 100 Pieces. And it's coming out from Yale University Press on the 13th of July. And if you look on Amazon or Yale, you can pre-order it if you're interested.
Very good. Will do. Thank you very much, Susan, for joining us. And thank you also, as always, to Richard and Charlotte. Next week, we're going to be picking our top 5 game changer moments when something, a piece, recording, performance, anything, changed the way we viewed it. My goodness, who knows what we're going to come up with for that one. Looking forward to it. See you then. If you enjoyed the Classical Top 5, please do consider making a donation. Details are always in the summaries of each of our podcasts. And if you want to follow us on Twitter, we're at Classical Top 5. On Facebook, we have a page, The Classical Top 5. Just search for that. And if you'd like to email us, because we always like to hear from you, please do. classicaltop5@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.